Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And when we get to the questions, I want to float around with Mike back there so we can pick up the questions so everybody can hear them. So bear with me when I'm floating around the room afterwards. You're on.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the warm welcome and the applause and the invitation, actually. It's good to be here. Been a very long time since I was in Kingsport. I lived away from here for some 25 years or so, and since I got back, I haven't had much business in Kingsport, so hadn't even been down to even find my way around. Had to use a GPS to get here, and it stopped out here at the intersection, so I had to figure out a couple of things. All right, let me swap hands here. I appreciate the invitation. It's very kind words that people have said to me today about my previous programs. It's about 3.5 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks maybe, over in Irwin. What I have today is a kind of an updated version of the talk that I gave then. Ukraine is something that I've been following kind of closely. I have to say up front that I don't have the access to the classified information that I used to have, but you'd be surprised how little the classified information differs from what you read in the press. A lot of the information gets out there sooner or later. The only difference is when you read it in the press, you have to be really careful about what's the truth and what's not, because they don't always agree, and at least somebody in that argument doesn't know. So you have to kind of be careful. Now, this slide means nothing. It's just to be sure that everybody can see this. Can you read that all right? I use that to make sure everything's working all right without giving away any of the program. Then I have to really start with a disclaimer. No animals were harmed in the production of this program. That's not entirely true. I did swat a mosquito while I was working on this, but I give myself a pass. That was self-defense. All right. What's ahead for the Ukraine and the rest of us? Now, you might notice I said the Ukraine. That's kind of a habit. The Ukraine is a different way of saying that. Ukraine is the official name of the country. The Ukraine means roughly the frontier or the far area, and that's when it was spoken of from a Soviet point of view or a Russian point of view. Now, I've spoken about Ukraine before in Irwin several times over the years, and I've got a lot of historical background and stuff in the other talks. I don't want to go into that. I'll just have a couple of things, background, how we got to where we are, a little bit about what's going on right now, and then what I really want to get to is some scenarios for how things might go over the next year or two. This is not all my invention here. I read a lot of military items online and elsewhere. I try to figure out what's going on and compare things one with another, try to understand what's really happening. And it's often hard to do because people don't agree. Even so-called experts don't agree. So what I've done is put together a lot of the propositions that some of them have made, put up some of the evidence, and try to figure which ones are most likely correct. Now let's jump back to last summer and fall. You might have seen maps like this. Similar maps were all over the news and so forth back then. There, of course, is Ukraine right in the middle. And you see all these red spots around here. This was the Russian troop buildup. Those spots indicate Russian military forces around Ukraine. They were out all over Western Russia and Belarus, which is allied to Russia up here. They were all over that area. They were doing very large military maneuvers. Now, that's not real unusual. That was a bit unusual just because of the size. And they kept saying, no, we're not going to attack Ukraine. We're not going to cause a war with Ukraine or anything like that. But at the same time, they kept building the troops up. And a lot of people did not think that there was going to be a war. I wasn't sure there was going to be a war for a long time. I thought what would happen is that the Russians would keep those forces there, keep building them up and ratchet up the tension and force some kind of a political concession from the Ukraine, primarily dealing with this dark red area down here. That is, as you can read there, I hope you can read it, controlled by Russian-backed separatists. Now, going back quite a while, there has been a separatist movement in that area. There are a lot of ethnic Russians in Ukraine because Ukraine was part of the old Soviet Union. It was part of the Russian Empire before that. But it's been independent now for 30 years. But starting around 2014, this separatist movement rose up and it got violent. They've actually been fighting this war for about 8 years. The separatists are aided by the Russians. They were back then from the beginning. They're getting arms and equipment and training, and there are probably Russian intelligence people there. I'd be surprised if there weren't. So that's been going on for some time. Now you might remember also in 2014, when that fighting was getting to a kind of a high pitch, suddenly Russia took over Crimea. Now the way they did it, you got to admire how well organized it was and how quickly they did it. They decided they wanted Crimea back. Crimea is part of Ukraine by international agreement, which Russia signed on to. Crimea is part of Ukraine. However, there were Russian military forces there by agreement. They had long-standing military bases there. And that was okay. Ukraine was all right with that. Probably couldn't have done much about it anyway. But over a period of time, the Russians reinforced their troops there, got everything in a row, everything organized, and then all at once they came out from their bases and grabbed key areas, road junctions, police stations, all civilian airports, all kinds of things, rushed out and grabbed control of them before the Ukrainians could really react. There was very little bloodshed when it happened, but in the space of a day, they took over Crimea. And later, they formally annexed it, said, okay, Crimea is now part of Russia. Now the people over here in the southeast, this area, this larger area in here is called the Donbass. You hear people refer to that on the news, the Donbass. I think that actually comes from the Don Basin because the Don River runs right up through here. And the Donbass actually, I think, goes over into Russia. But that's not important. This is a fairly industrialized portion of Ukraine. It's where a lot of their industry is, including a lot of mines, mineral extraction, and so forth. It's also where there are a lot of ethnic Russians. Now, one thing to remember is that there are a lot of ethnic Russians all over Ukraine. That is, their family comes from Russia. And a lot of Ukrainians speak Russian because during the Soviet era, they were taught Russian in school. So there's a lot of, from a security point of view, from an intelligence point of view, there's a lot of vulnerability there. There are a whole lot of potential Russian agents in Ukraine. And everybody assumed for many years that the Ukrainian security services and military have probably all been penetrated by the Russians to some extent. Okay, so the Russians thought they had a big advantage. Not only did they have this big army built up there, but they had a lot of friends on the inside. And they thought they could pull off this invasion real quick, and that the Ukrainian government would fold, and the Ukrainian government would probably leave the country, and they would win pretty quick. But what they didn't count on was that the Ukrainians did not want to join Russia, most of them, including a lot of the ethnic Russians. All right, don't want to get bogged down in this, but this is pretty much how things looked. Those red spots are the Russian forces. Now, with them scattered all around, the Ukrainians had to plan for the possibility of an attack from any direction. Potentially, the Russians could have come from anywhere. The Ukrainians had to be ready for that, so they had to spread their forces very thin. And before I move on, I want to point out this area right here. See this string of blue things right there? You'll see it later when I raise the cover on the map. That is the Dnipro River. It's a big river to start with, but it has a series of dams. And behind those dams are long, narrow lakes. They're just like the lakes on the Tennessee River system, the TVA lakes. You see the dam, and then you see a gigantic, long, narrow lake running up between the mountains. It's a very similar thing. Now, I just want to show it there because it's not always clear on the other slides. All right, so this is what the Ukrainians had to prepare for. This is what a lot of people expected. First, down here in the southeast, we expected a movement out from the separatist area because one of the things they want is to unite this whole area, two whole provinces there, under their control and be annexed to Russia. Some countries have already recognized them as independent. North Korea, for one, I don't know who else. But there was an expansion out from there, met by an advance from Crimea. So the point of this is, what I thought their major goal would be to unite this area and this area, join the two with a land bridge, so you've got a land connection from Crimea all the way back to Russia proper. And then that whole area would separate from Ukraine and be part of Russia again, be annexed by Russia. That's what I thought. Now, as the supposed maneuvers began to wind down, some of the troops looked like they were going back to Russia. But if you watch close, which we try to do, you would see that, yeah, some troops are going back to Russia, but a whole lot of them are going from one part of the front to another part. They're just moving around. For example, there was a lot of film of Russian troops going across a bridge. There's a huge bridge connected to the Russian mainland here. You see Russian troops going across that bridge. Indications are they just went over there and came up here, right back to the Ukrainian border again. So they're shuffling around to make it look like they were backing down. But when they were supposed to be closing down these maneuvers, these troops up here were not moving as much. They were still bunched up right up here. And you see that arrow going right there points directly at the capital. So a lot of people thought, myself included, okay, they're going to push hard down here and have a big fight down here. At the same time, they're going to make a strong run on Kiev and try to grab it very quickly, 3 or 4 days, some people thought, and then force the government to throw up their hands, surrender, maybe just haul freight to, to another country. If you remember, when things started getting dicey, the U.S. government offered the Ukrainian president a ride. They offered him free passage out. Said, we will take you somewhere. Where do you want to go? Because we didn't want him taken prisoner or whatever once the fighting started. But by then the fight was on, and Zelensky, whatever you might think of him, whether he was qualified or not or whatever, he said, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. He was determined to fight, and the government stayed put. They did not evacuate the city, and their troops stood up. They did not fold up the way the Russians thought they would. So this area up here really bogged down. You probably saw the long convoys through the woods being bombed and hit by artillery and so forth, all jammed up on these little narrow roads. There are a lot of reasons for that, which gets kind of down in the military weeds. I'm a kind of a military nerd, okay, so I like this stuff, but I realize not everybody does. One problem they had was they waited just a little too long to start their ground offensive, and the ground had started to thaw. The ground was frozen. The deepest freeze in that part of the world in midwinter is about the middle of February. They were about a week late, and it wasn't such a bad winter, so the ground had started to thaw a little bit. So you've got these heavy tanks rolling down a handful of narrow roads through the marshy area. They come under fire, they pull off the road to take cover, and then they sink into the mud. They can't get out again. And they don't have enough recovery vehicles, no way to get those tanks back out and put them back on the road. And that happened again and again. They also didn't have enough infantry with them, but that's another problem. Okay, so this is what I expected and what a lot of people expected. A big move here, a big move here. So, they did do a lot of those things. Come on. They did do those things, but they did a lot more. They came at Kiev from 2 directions. I keep saying Kiev, that's what I learned in school. It's Kiev. The difference is Kiev comes from the Russian pronunciation and Kiev comes from the Ukrainian, not the same language. So you see the spelling and the pronunciation changes. So up here, Kharkiv, which I learned as Kharkov, was under pressure, plus the Russians advanced this way. They came at Kiev from the other direction. They expanded a little bit over here, burst up out of Crimea in 2 directions, one toward the separatist area and one toward the river up here, with the eye to hooking back around and going toward Odessa. Okay, this happened in just a few days. In just a few days, they made that much progress. But it all bogged down. These fellows up here, they got bogged down and they had to pull back. These folks pulled back. These folks pulled back. Some of these even pulled back temporarily. All right, but what they did was they shifted their forces. They decided we can't do everything at once. The biggest mistake they made was what some of our military leaders called failure to weight the main effort. Weighting the main effort means that you select what you really want to do and you put your force there. You might have to shift later, but you've got one main objective and you need to follow that as long as it's feasible. They did not do that. They tried to do everything at once. Okay, now this is focused down on the southeast after the northern attacks and the northeastern attacks have pretty much pulled back. This is the area down here. Here's the Russian separatist area right there. Now, these large arrows came with the map. They're showing the Russian advances up to this point. The long, narrow arrows, I added to that. This is what I expected to happen at this point. I expected an axis of advance from the south going up this way, one from the north going down this way to join up right here, probably supported by this attack. And what would then happen would be that the Ukrainian forces here, which are some of their best units, been fighting for years, those forces would be cut off. They would either be cut off, surrounded, and forced to surrender, or they'd be forced to retreat to avoid that. That's what I expected. But the fact is, the Russians couldn't pull that off. They couldn't make it happen. The Ukrainians fought hard, fought for every piece of ground. Now, this is pretty much the way it is now. This is a map as of like a week ago, but the lines haven't changed very much. You see the dark red areas are the areas that the Russians controlled at the start of the current offensive. The pink is what they have gained. If you can see the small blue areas around the inner edge here, those are areas that the Ukrainians have taken back in counteroffensives, okay? They're starting to make some headway in pushing them backward. And there's a little spot right here, dark blue with stripes. That is an area of partisan warfare. That's guerrilla warfare in the occupied territories by Ukrainians, all right? What that amounts to here, it's not very much. Right now, it's just occasionally you go out to relieve a sentry and you find him with his throat cut. You know, a building burns over here and a truck blows up over there. Small scale so far. Aha. Now we go to the map. I make this really dramatic. You know, I've kept this covered up. You probably think, oh, it's something horribly secret, right? And I get this a lot. People say, if you tell us that, do you have to kill us? Now say no. No. I know you're all good Americans. I expect you to kill yourselves. All right? So I'm going to switch this off right here to save the battery. And I'm going to reveal the map. Okay. All this is really, it's just a map of Ukraine, obviously. I got this map. This is something I do. I did this for myself, not because of this talk or the previous ones. I got this myself. Got the map online, put a piece of acetate over it, stuck it on a piece of cardboard, and there we are. Now, let me do something here. Now, I like to switch off for a couple of reasons. Well, part of this, like many of you, I'm sure, at some point you've had some kind of training in methods of instruction, how to give instruction, how to do a class or whatever. Okay, part of that is it's good sometimes to have more than one thing for the audience to look at. At the same time, you don't want them both up at the same time so that the audience's attention is focused where you want it, okay? So I kept the map covered until I reached this stopping point here. Now, one other thing I learned in methods of instruction, if you're using a whiteboard, and you've got to erase something, you've got to turn your back on the audience to erase something, erase up and down. Because if you erase side to side, it makes your bottom wiggle. Distracts the audience, okay? They won't get your point. All right. Now, why do I like maps? I like maps. That's why I have this map here. I like it, and it's my program. Okay? So I wanted to show this map to give you an idea of how big Ukraine is. You hear all the time about, oh yeah, it's a pretty good sized country and all that. It doesn't tell you anything. You hear things like, oh, such and such piece of ground is the size of New Jersey. You think, well, I don't know really how big New Jersey is. What does that really tell me? We in the U.S. often think that if we haven't heard much about a country, we don't know much about it, it must be small and unimportant. That's not true. Ukraine is a pretty good sized country. The reason I have the tape measure up here is because this particular map. This map is at a scale of 1 to 1 million. That means that one unit of measure, whether it's inches, feet, or whatever, on the map is equal to 1 million of those units on the ground. Well, you're thinking of 1 million feet or 1 million inches, it doesn't tell you very much, just big numbers. But if you go to the metric system, like I know a lot of the military veterans here are familiar with, to some degree anyway, the metric system works really well for this kind of thing. I have a tape measure here with inches and centimeters. Now out here is 1 meter, just a shade over 39 inches, okay? 1 meter on this map is 1 million meters on the ground. Okay? Another big number, doesn't mean anything to you. But 1 million meters happens to be 1,000 kilometers. If you travel a lot in Europe or you've been in the military, you're probably used to thinking in kilometers, okay? But if you're not, it still makes it easy because 1,000 kilometers is about 620 miles. Okay, so 620 miles only gets you a part of the way across Ukraine. If you stretch it out, the Ukraine actual borders, or the heavy purple line, goes all the way out to the margin of the map. Okay, so if you convert all this, it comes to about 950 miles or so. Okay, that's pretty big. And north to south, all the way from the bottom of Crimea up to the top, is about 550 miles. All right, so that gives you a little bit of an idea of how big an area we're talking about. And something else to consider, you can see I've made some marks on here, and I'll explain these marks here in a minute. But those marks, made with a regular dry erase marker, cover up several miles of territory on the ground. So you want to be careful what you stick on the map when you're putting the information up here. Now these little cards, they represent the green Ukrainian and the red is Russian. They represent the major military commands, as nearly as I can figure them out from open sources. And the little numbers on here are individual units within those commands. Now why do I do that? I started out putting brigades along the front line and it was just too cluttered. You couldn't read anything. But one thing it helps you do, if you're following this, is that you have individual units named here. This is the attack that went toward Kiev from the west. This is the one that came from the east. A lot of the units that pulled back were so badly chewed up in the fighting, they had to be pulled completely back to depots and be refurbished. They had to be filled up with replacements. Some of them had to combine with other units in order to have a unit that was worth having, that was combat effective. I know that you can't see this. You're welcome to come up and look at it later. Some of these have little check marks beside them. Those are the ones that have been pulled back, refurbished, joined up with others or whatever, and then appeared down here. When these offensives failed, they shifted a good portion of the units over to here, down where the continual fighting's going on, and the progress has been very slow. So they've shifted their main effort down here to the Donbass, okay? All right, so I like to put the map out there because it helps you see all these things at one time, where the little bits of map that you see online don't do that. Now, one other thing, talking about the size of Ukraine. Not only is it important because it's big, it's important because of where it is. You might have heard on the news, it's the second largest country in Europe. The only other country bigger than Ukraine in Europe is Russia itself. And a good portion of Russia is pretty empty, lightly populated. So if you talk about important countries, think about Germany or France or Spain. Those are pretty important countries. They're all smaller than Ukraine. It's bigger than any of those countries. It's bigger than all of the islands of Japan put together. All right, so a pretty good sized piece of territory. Plus, with the location that it has Russia over here and NATO over here. So it's right in the middle between the two potentially major combatants. And which way it goes or which side controls it is very important to both of those. All right? Okay. One last thing on the map. All right. Early in the war, Russian troops came over here, crossed over the Dnieper River. You see the red marks that I have along the river. I mentioned those lakes created by the dams, the reservoirs. That river, which was already a big river, is now between 2 and 15 miles wide. A lot of places 20 miles wide. That means it's very hard to get across it if somebody's shooting at you. There are only a few places where there are significant bridges across that river. That is, big highway bridges that could take military traffic. Only a few places to cross. So what the Russians did very early on, they came out and they grabbed a couple of those crossing points and they got forces across that river before the Ukrainians could really slow them down. Now, the Ukrainians have begun a counteroffensive. It started off slow at this point. They're not ready to really make a push. But this area between the river and the front line here right there, has about 25,000 Russian soldiers in it, and all their equipment and so forth. And there's only 2 places to cross the river. 2 bridges down here at Kherson, and another one up here at Nova Kakova. That's really the name. But the bridge up north, that's just a road that goes across the top of a dam. They don't want to blow that up because it's going to flood everything downstream. All right, so they're attacking the approaches to the bridge. The Ukrainians are using our new accurate rockets that we gave them, and they're bombing the tar out of those approaches to that road. And they're damaging the 2 bridges down here at Kherson. Now, what they may potentially do is be able to cut off those troops. Here's the river right here. Here's the front line. Here are the areas that the Ukrainians have recaptured, the light blue areas. I know that's pretty hard to see. But there is the potential that the Ukrainians, by bombing these bridges and making them moderately usable, they haven't destroyed them yet, making them hard to use, that they may be able to cut off those Russian troops in that area. Now, they don't want to destroy those bridges because they want to be able to able to cross the river themselves. What they're doing is they're damaging the bridges so that the traffic is limited. You can still walk across them, maybe get a small vehicle across, but you can't bring heavy trucks or tanks across. So the Russians are running ferries back and forth across the river, and they've got little pontoon bridges stashed here and there trying to supply their troops that way. But potentially there is a major victory brewing here for the Ukrainians if they can pull it off. I just don't think yet that they have the force to do it. It's going to take a while, and we'll get to that in a minute. Now, what they're also doing, real quick, going back to the map, by putting the pressure on the Russians on this side, they're drawing forces from that side and allowing them to hold off the Russian offensive in the east. It's causing them they have to strip their forces and move them to the west. All right, here's some scenarios that several people have gotten together and worked these up, and they've written them up in various places. Scenario 1, how could Ukraine win this? Ukraine wins. So what does that mean? That means Russia is stopped and they're pushed back, pushed out of all the territory that they've gained. That's what Ukraine says that they want. We want all the Russians gone from all of our territory. That means that we win. Anything else is a defeat for us. That's what the Ukrainians say. It's going to be very hard to do. What is that going to require? Ukraine is going to have to build an offensive force in addition to their forces that are barely holding the Russians back in some places and taking heavy losses to do it. They're going to have to come up with a force of about 100,000 people, well equipped, well trained, to push the Russians out if the Russians don't want to leave. That means the West has to maintain our current level of aid to keep them in the fight and give them more stuff, including good stuff and training, which takes a long time, so that they build that big offensive force. That's the only way they're going to push the Russians out. And that is going to have to go on for several years, and it's a huge drain, not just in money, but a lot of the supplies we've been giving them, that's out of our war stocks. We're using stuff out of our warehouses, and that has to be replaced. Okay? So it's going to be very costly. That's the way that Ukraine can actually win this. Scenario 2, Russia wins. What's it going to take for Russia to win? Maybe, just maybe, the Ukrainian army over here in the east would collapse. Some people think that could happen. If the Russians have a couple of good breaks, and it looked like they were doing pretty well for a while, they can't do that big encirclement that I talked about on that earlier map. They can't do that. What they've been doing, and I talked about it more in the previous talk, is they're taking little chunks, little bits of territory at a time, gradually moving in the direction of those arrows that we're going to meet behind the Ukrainians. But it's very slow and very costly. You ever hear the old story? How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. They're trying to eat the elephant one bite at a time, but the elephant does not want to be eaten, all right? They're having a hard time. So, if they were to destroy those forces there, that's the large portion of the Ukrainian army. Ukraine would be much weakened by that and might not be able to defend the rest of the country. So maybe Kiev said, well, nothing we can do about it now. We've lost, and let's cut a deal. And maybe they give them a portion of their territory. Oh, come on. There we go. Now, what does this need? In order to bring this about, the Russians have to continue feeding troops and equipment into the war. They're taking a lot of losses. They're going to have to keep on feeding them in. They're already having trouble recruiting more people, all right? They're sending in people that are not fully trained, which means more of them get killed. It might require extensive mobilization in Russia. Russia, for public relations reasons and for the benefit of its own population, Russia has not wanted to declare a full mobilization. That is, calling up all your reserve units, filling up all of your regular military units with new recruits and so forth. They didn't want to do that. They're doing what they're calling a shadow mobilization, pulling up a few people here and there. They also are calling up veterans. People have been out of the service for a while. They hire them on as contractors. Here's a guy who spent 5 years in the military taking care of surface-to-air missiles or whatever. He knows what he's doing. Pay him a lot of money, bring him back in. Okay? They're doing a lot of that. But they're still not filling up their units. Scenario 3, partial victory for Russia. What does that look like? Maybe they take the Donbass area, which they may be able to do, but Ukraine stays in the fight. Maybe Ukraine is able to withdraw without losing that whole army group there in the Donbass. Maybe they're able to pull back and continue the fight. So what does that look like? Next move, Russia's got to ratchet up the pressure somehow. Maybe they attack Kharkiv, which is up here, right about there. If they take this area, and Ukraine's still fighting, then they move on Kharkiv again. They've tried to take it before and been pushed back. They might try Odessa. Odessa is way over here, but that's kind of out of reach at this point. They failed to get that far once, and they may be pushed back from it. That's a long reach for them. So let's take a look at what that might take. To take Kharkiv might require 100,000 additional Russian troops, according to some estimates. Because why is that? It's because it's a big city. Kharkiv's well over 1 million people, and it's got suburbs and things all around it. It's a heavily urbanized area at the core. It's going to take an awful lot to take that from somebody who doesn't want you to have it. It's going to be a very hard fight. That would mean mobilization and or use of most of Russia's active duty troops. They have already thinned out a lot of their ordinary standing army from other parts of their border and sent them to Ukraine or shifted them around to allow other people to go to Ukraine. They're already doing that. They would have to do more. Okay, this is just a map of the Kharkiv area. You notice it's spelled KH on the map, and in most books it's CH up here, Kharkiv. And if you can see that, I don't know how well this shows up. The hashed area right in there, that's the urban area. That's about 10 or 12 miles wide. Okay, it's a big, large city, the beltway around it like most cities have. And by the way, this map is older than that map. How can you tell? Can't see it from where you are. But the beltway is not finished. It's finished on this map. Okay, so that's an older map. Why does that do you any good? I don't know. I just thought it was neat. All right, you see all these small towns and things around there. Each of those is a potential outpost for the defending side. You got the main fortress, and you've got little outposts all around. It's going to take a lot of effort to get into that or into any big city like that. Okay, scenario 4, stalemate. A lot of people are saying this is how it's going to end up, or at least how it's going to continue for a while. What does this mean? Russia takes northern Donbass. A lot of people assume that they're going to get that, but they see they're not going to get anywhere else, and they order their troops to dig in where they are, hold what they've got. No further attack on Kharkiv or Odessa. But what happens here, fighting slows down a little bit. Both sides try to develop more forces with the eye toward resuming the offensive in a few months. Okay? In the next couple of months or so, we should know whether the Ukrainians have the power to cut off those 25,000 people west of the Dnipro. And those are I think that's the 49th Combined Arms Army, if you ever hear that term. That's a Russian military formation. If they can cut off the 49th and either force them to withdraw or possibly force them to surrender, that's a major victory. But that might not defeat the Russians. The Russians are still going to want to hold what they've got. In the next few months, we'll know which way it's going to go. I think there's a good chance that they're going to fight hard into the fall. When the winter sets in the next couple of months or so, they're going to be kind of slowed down. They're going to use the winter to hold what they've got, build up more forces, and look again at picking it up again in the spring. Now here's a hard truth to think about. Stalemate means a long, low-level fight like the one that's been going on in the East for 8 years. There might be unconventional or guerrilla warfare in the occupied parts of Ukraine. It's already started. I mentioned that part in the south there a little while ago. You might remember that when there was a build-up to war, it started looking like there was really going to be a war, U.S. Special Forces and our allies in NATO, their special forces, started getting together and planning to support a guerrilla war inside Ukraine because they thought that a large part of Ukraine would probably be occupied if it came to a fight. So they are already prepared and already supporting low-level guerrilla operations in Ukraine. Plus, they're training the conventional forces that Ukraine is going to need if they're going to retake their territory. Thing is, this goes on for a long time. The world community, if there is such a thing, if this goes on long enough, they're going to increase pressure on both sides. You're going to have to come to terms. People are starving. You know about the grain shipments that couldn't get out for months and months. They've started again, but there's already about a 5-month gap in the flow of that food, the flow of those supplies. That gap is going to move through the system. We're still using the food harvested in the past year. It's this current harvest, the crops that are in the field now, are going to come up short. Some of them have been destroyed in the field. Some of them have been destroyed in grain elevators. The coming harvest, the next harvest, will be affected by the shortage of fertilizer because that's been cut back too. Upcoming harvests in many parts of the world are going to be smaller next year. So the food situation could get really bad. The world community is going to pressure both sides to try and cut some kind of a deal. Time may be on Russia's side. Now, you get a lot of argument about this because you can read other arguments that will say time is on Ukraine's side. Russia's taken heavy losses. Ukraine is recruiting more troops. Eventually, Ukraine, with the help of the West, Ukraine will be able to win this, eventually. Other people say the opposite, that Russia can stick it out. As long as Russia can withstand the sanctions, and so far they've been doing it, Putin remains in power and Russia can stay in the fight. Personally, I'd like to see Putin go away. I think there's a lot of people that would like to see that. But you can't guarantee that. All the people around him who'd be in a position to push him away are his old buds from the KGB. It's going to be really hard to move him out of there. Come on. Now, I want to be clear about this. This is what Putin may believe, not what I believe. Putin may believe that the West is going to get tired of this. If this goes on for a long time, and you know the West doesn't have a great record in long, extended wars, we tend to get tired of things and leave. If this keeps going on, the West will get tired of expensive energy and shortages of food. The developing world is going to be starving, begging for help, and maybe, well, Ukraine will also be bled white, and just maybe the West will cave. The West will get tired of this, force some kind of a settlement on the Ukrainians, maybe even withdraw aid to force the thing to a stop. That's what Putin may be counting on. Now, we'll go to questions here for just 1 second. I do want to take a half a minute to remind you of one thing. A lot of widows and orphans in Ukraine. If you can help out with Food for the Poor or any of the people that are helping Ukraine, it's a good thing to do. I know everybody's got in Kiwanis, you've probably got a special thing in your heart for children. You want to help the kids of Ukraine. Lots of widows and orphans over there. I just want you to consider that you might want to consider adoption. Adopt a Ukrainian before it's too late. I was waiting there. I wasn't sure you were paying attention.